Thank you, Hélène. I'm vastly relieved to learn that you can find your place in the transformation that you have undergone in your life from a naturalist to dealing with analogous people and then with totemist people, because the basic idea of these schemes is that any one of us can adopt a position at one moment and then another position at another moment, but these schemes are the generative devices that, when they are systematized, help us as models to understand cultural differences, let's say, and different ways of being in the world. So you asked me to introduce myself. I'll do it very briefly. I have no training in the natural sciences, but as many French social scientists, I started as a philosopher, and I was in a tradition that goes to Durkheim and Lévi-Strauss and others. I found that philosophy as a self-reflexive attitude towards the concept that had been produced in the West was a very stimulating exercise, but that it would be much more interesting to understand how other people away from this tradition invented new concepts which were difficult for us to grasp, and also in a way transform their collective experience of the world into concepts, or at least into ways of being that could lend themselves to be concepts. This is why after I started I taught philosophy for 1 year as a young teacher. In France, philosophy is taught in the secondary education, the last year of secondary education. And then I went to see Lévi-Strauss and asked him whether he would be my supervisor, and I went to Amazonia. And I was interested, of course, in Amazonia I was interested in the relationship between societies and their environment, and I thought that Amazonia was a good place to start. It happened that I spent 3 years there in the same place with a group of people in the upper Amazon called the Achua, to which I was back a few weeks ago. And one of it wasn't out of nostalgia for pristineness or for authenticity or things like that. I was interested in understanding how a group of humans was dealing with its environment. And in fact, what happened, and I'd chosen this specific group of people because they had accepted the first peaceful contact not long before. So there was no major transformation in the way they were dealing with the environment. There was no wage labor, there was no money, it was a so-called traditional society. And I spent, as I said, almost 3 years there to begin with, trying to understand their relationship with the environment. And after that, I understood that my initial ambition was completely warped, in the sense that I wanted to understand how they adapted to their environment, both intellectually, mentally, physically, technically, etc. And in fact, I understood that they had created their environment. And that there was no environment as such, there was no nature to begin with, because they had constant and daily interactions with non-humans. This is how I began to term the other term of the relation that they had established, that humans had established, plant, animal, spirits, etc. And so that it was a fraud to transform this multiplicity of relations with non-humans into, or to hypostasize this into a major category that we call nature. And so that's how I started being interested in that topic. And over the years, as an came back to do fieldwork, but also I read a lot of ethnography, and I became aware that what we call nature here in the West had no meaning at all in anywhere else. And so that we couldn't resolve to using this very basic terminology, relationship between man and nature, which I learned as a philosopher, because in fact, even in our own context, it was a quite recent conceptualization, which was in fact born here in Germany as a way to organize the epistemologically fields of research at the end of the 19th century and the beginning of the 20th century. So the objective was then, if there is no basic overhanging relationship between man and nature, what are the different forms of interaction there exist? And I started, and as you said, an ontological program, which is based on the idea that these forms are predicated on the continuities and discontinuities that people detect between themselves and as humans and non-humans. I'll stop here because I won't talk about the various schemes that you mentioned, but about the Anthropocene as seen from this specific perspective. But I very happily will return to that afterwards in our conversation if you wish to do so. One of my great heroes is who did fieldwork also in South America and Middle America is Alexander von Humboldt, which inspired me a lot and inspired the kind of anthropology I'm doing. And in a letter to Schiller, his friend, Humboldt defined the object of his investigation as the study, and I quote him, the progressive habitability of the surface of the globe, by which he meant the way in which humans had progressively transformed their environments so as to suit their these environments, so their users, and to form ecosystems within which they had become decisive forces. And if Humboldt saw the Earth as a sort of great living organism where everything is interconnected, thus anticipating Lovelock's Gaia hypothesis, it was also clear for him that humans were an integral part of this sort of organism, and that because of this feature, the natural history of man was inseparable from the human history of nature. Nevertheless, 2 centuries later, after this letter, which I was referring to, the urgent question is rather, how did we trigger off a process which will render the Earth not more and more habitable, but less and less habitable? And what can be done to deflect this movement? What happened between the optimistic admission by Humboldt that all the forces of nature, including humans, are interconnected, and the increasingly obvious evidence that what was at the time not yet called, of course, Anthropocene, has become the symptom and the symbol of a terrible failure of humankind? Well, 2 things at least have happened. First, the anthropization of the planet, which Humboldt was already observing, has reached a critical threshold in domains which he had not foreseen. Global warming, of course, the erosion of biodiversity, the acidification of the oceans, the pollution of waters, soils, of the air, and it is even possible to consider recent human activities in the biological domain as having become the dominant pressure of selection in a way. New products such as antibiotics, pesticides, genetically modified organisms, combined with the disseminations of new species in new habitats, with the circulation of pathogens, crossing species boundaries, with intensive monoculture, and with the selective effects of higher temperature of the atmosphere and the oceans, all conspire to alter evolutionary processes. And as the marine ecologist Stephen Palumbi writes, I quote him, humans have now become the greatest evolutionary force on Earth. The second difference with the time of Humboldt, who nevertheless was himself an early critic of the devastation brought about by Iberian colonialism in the Americas, is that a small portion of humankind has meanwhile appropriated the earth and has ravaged it to secure or to ensure what it defines as its well-being, to the detriment of a multitude of other humans and non-humans who pay daily the consequences of this rapacity. Thus, it is not humankind in general which generated the Anthropocene. It is a system, it is a mode of life, it is an ideology, a way of instilling meaning to the world, the seduction of which is constantly expanding, and the peculiarities of which we must understand if we want to end up with it, thus attempting to deflect its most dramatic consequences. So I want to get back for a moment to these two processes, anthropization and the appropriation of Earth, before considering the reform of our conceptions that might lead to new forms of being in the world. What lays behind this new stage of the history of the Earth that has become known under the label Anthropocene? What lays behind that? What is new in the Anthropocene, by contrast with the continuous process or movement of anthropization of the Earth, whose effects are visible as soon as the beginning of the Holocene? We know now that even the ecosystems of regions which appear to have been hardly impacted by human activities before the European colonization, such as Amazonia or Australia, these ecosystems have been deeply transformed in the course of the past 10 millennia by human techniques, in particular Sweden horticulture, silviculture, selective bushfires in Australia in particular, but also in eastern South America, and a few millennia before, by this major event, the extinction of the megafauna of the Pleistocene, which is a phenomenon of huge magnitude in Australia and in the Americas, following the arrival of the first human occupants. So even in these regions, there has been a massive effect on the environment of the humans. However, within this continuous movement of anthropization, which has impacted numerous dimensions of ecosystems, notably the density and the distribution of animal and vegetal species, the Anthropocene stands out primarily by the implications of human activities on the climate and by its effect by the effect of this transformation of the climate on the condition for life on Earth. We are obviously on the verge of a major shift in the functioning of the Earth system, the consequences of which can be roughly anticipated at a global level, although we hardly know how and to what extent they will affect local conditions of existence. If the social sciences, then, have a role to play in this new era, called the Anthropocene, both as analytical tools and as thought experiments on different forms of envisioning the future, it is because they are in a position to mobilize different scales of time and space so as to take hold of the whole gamut of transformations which will affect, when it has not already begun, the manners of inhabiting the Earth by different collectives of humans and non-humans. These variations in scale are already visible, for instance, in the amplitude of the differences between the various definitions of the Anthropocene, into which I won't enter now. And these variations are, of course, linked to the dates that were propounded for the beginning of this new geological era. To begin with, I must confess that it took me a long time to perceive the catastrophic nature, in the literal sense of the term, of the change of climatic regime, and to measure the difference between the difference in kind between, on the one hand, the continuous anthropization of the planet since well before the Holocene, and on the other hand, what a growing number of researchers in the earth sciences now call the Anthropocene. I could invoke mitigating circumstances for this blindness, for, as I said before, when introducing myself, for more than 40 years I've studied, as an anthropologist, the interactions between humans and non-humans in parts of the planet which had remained in a large measure apart from the direct effect produced by the Industrial Revolution on terrestrial ecosystems. I thus did not need to be convinced that the majority of biotopes had been deeply affected by human activities, even in places, again, like Amazonia or Australia, where this impact was not directly visible, but had to be reconstructed through scientific method. To go back to an example that has had my attention for some time, the floristic composition, as you probably know, of the Amazonian forest has been deeply transformed in the course of the last 10 millennia by the manipulation of plants by the Amerindians, with the result that the overall rate of biodiversity being equal, the zones affected by human action present a much higher density of plants that are useful to humans than those where humans were scarce. And of course, it's due to the transplantation of wild plants into Swedens. It would thus be absurd to reason, as it was very common to do at one time, especially when I became interested 40 years ago in this problem, in this kind of problem, as if human populations in this region of the world had to adapt socially, culturally, and technically to ecosystems which would have remained impervious to any anthropic influence. In some, anthroposphere, biosphere, and geosphere never appeared to me as separate entities, And this is why Humboldt is a great source of inspiration, because he was one of the pioneers in this. And if I've given the name Anthropology of Nature to my chair at the Collège de France, thus providing some motive for wonder among my colleagues, it was precisely because I felt necessary to display this conviction publicly. However, I ended up by realizing that anthropization and Anthropocene are two very different things. Anthropization results from this movement of co-evolution of humans and non-humans, uninterrupted during the past approximately 300,000 years, which fashioned the Earth by altering the ecosystems and their modes of functioning, sometimes irreversibly, and with important, albeit unintentional, regional effects, as is the case, for instance, of the incidence of deforestation in local climatic cycles. Suffice to mention the drying up of the rainforest in Borneo, for instance, which is also linked to other factors, but which is partly fueled by, fueled is a well-chosen word, by deforestation and augmented by, of course, by forest fires. So while Anthropocene, by contrast, designates something entirely different, it's a more embracing systemic effect to which the alteration of local ecosystems no doubt contribute in part, but whose general results are a cumulative and progressively acceleration of the transformations of the climatic regime of the Earth. So it's a transformation, the consequences of which will be felt during a great many centuries, perhaps millennia. A transformation which can be dated, I think, to the beginning of the Industrial Revolution in the 1800s. And this is not to deny, of course, that regional alterations of ecosystems may have had an influence on the global climatic cycle, such as the drop, for instance, in forest clearings following the demographic collapse of Amerindians after the European conquest. But these influences remained weak and short-lived. Perhaps I could return to this last event. As some of you may know, Simon Lewis and Mark Maslin have made the intriguing proposition to retain the date of 1610 for the beginning of the Anthropocene because of a slight decrease in the concentration of atmospheric CO2 observable in the Antarctic ice cap for the period from 1570 to 1620. And this decrease, they argue, would come from the massive decrease in forest clearings following the European invasion of the Americas, a decrease which resulted from the destruction of approximately 9/10 of the native population caused by infectious diseases, massacres, reduction to slavery, etc. So the result of this process would have been the spontaneous regeneration of millions of acres of vegetal cover, thus contributing to an increase in the rate of carbon sequestration by trees. So the correlation is plausible, and it highlights, a contrario, the impact in terms of ecosystemic and geochemical transformation that vegetal manipulations by humans is likely to produce, in the case by the suspension of vegetal manipulation. However, even if the indirect hypothetic cause of the variations in CO2 was horrifying in the sense that it's the quasi-disappearance or destruction of the inhabitants of a continent, the magnitude of these variations remains too weak to be distinguishable, really, for certain, from natural variations. The same can be said of geophysical events like the eruption of the Tambora in 1815 or the Krakatoa in 1883. Their impact was notable at the scale of the planet, and it induced dramatic effect in some places, like precisely the highlands of New Guinea, to which Hélène was referring, where the memory remains up to now of the starvation and deaths caused by the decrease in temperature that were caused by these eruptions. So in spite of that, however, these events have not affected in a durable manner the climatic balance and at the scale of the Earth. In other words, the most plausible date for the beginning of the Anthropocene remains the beginning of the Industrial Revolution at the end of the 18th century, and as you know, it is no surprise that it is the date that the inventors of the notion of the concept of Anthropocene, Paul Crutzen and Eugene Sturmer, have themselves retained when they chose for the beginning of this new geological era the perfectioning of the steam engine by James Watt. To qualify now the Anthropocene as a global transformation of the system of the Earth, beginning a little over 2 centuries ago, presents simultaneously an advantage and a risk for the social sciences and more generally for the ways in which human communities face this transformation. I do not mean here the debate that goes on and will probably, I don't know if it will ever be solved between geologists whether there is indeed what they call a golden spike to identify the specific beginning of a geological era that could be qualified as the Anthropocene. More crucial, it seems to me, is the identification of the responsibilities for this phenomenon and the responses that can be brought to it. In fact, the questions we have to ask ourselves is which collectives of humans and non-humans, which types of practices and beings, which modes of existence are the cause of what sorts of alteration of the interactions between geosphere, biosphere, and anthropospheres. What are the scales of space and time within which these phenomena happen, and how are these scales encapsulated? From this point of view, assigning the end of the 18th century to the beginning of the new geological era is a welcome initiative, since it permits to dissipate the vagueness surrounding the definition of this mysterious anthropos, who gives its dynamic to the Anthropocene. For it is not the whole of humankind, of course, who caused global warming or the sixth extinction of species. Whatever the incidence of the activities of native Amazonians or native Australians on the ecosystems that they contributed to shape, it is not them who are the cause of the 1/3 increase in the atmospheric concentration of CO2, of the acidification of the oceans, or of the melting down of glaciers. The main cause for the Anthropocene, as I've already said, is the development since a few centuries, first in Western Europe and then in other parts of the world, of a mode of composition of the world which was diversely called according to the feature one wished to emphasize: industrial capitalism, thermodynamic revolution, technocene, modernity, and which I tended to call naturalism. What is exactly this system? To begin with, it is based, for the first time in the history of humanity, on the affirmation of a difference of nature and not anymore of kind or of degree, a difference of kind rather than a difference of degree between humans and non-humans, a difference which emphasizes the fact that humans share with non-humans universal features or physical and chemical properties, but are distinguished, the humans are distinguished from non-humans by their moral and cognitive dispositions. And the result is the emergence of a hypostasized nature in relation to which humans occupy a sort of overhanging position. The better to know this nature and the better to master it, this separation being the guiding principle of the ontology, which I've called naturalism. This ontological foundation was complemented by a major change in the nature and use of energy. For millennia, agrarian societies, not necessarily agricultural societies, but societies living off the earth, had been based on solar energy, that is, on the photosynthesis of plants and their conversion into food, and upon the energy produced by the guided action of humans and animals. So the pillars of life were land and labor, resources which had remained inalienable for the most part of human history. This is a thing which has to be emphasized. The development of mercantile capitalism and the colonial and the imperialist system on which the former rested have permitted the global diversification of the sources of energy, of raw materials, and of manufactured goods, as well as their perequation thanks to money. Everything became convertible thanks to money, and the differences in the cost of production rendered possible by the cheap transformation of goods transform the goods into a source of considerable financial profits. The consequence is that not only, as Marx had clearly seen, money derived now from the transfer of goods instead of being a simple means of the transfer of goods, but money also became the instrument allowing the procurement of a cheap energy disconnected from the control of agricultural land. So one was thus entering in the major illusion of the two last centuries, nature as an infinite resource, allowing an infinite growth thanks to the infinite improvement of techniques. And in that sense, Watt's machine is not so much the primary cause of the entry into the Anthropocene, it's rather the first result of the acceleration of mercantile exchange, acceleration which rendered necessary the control of fossil energies, henceforth more important for production and transport than the energy stocked in organisms. There's nothing new in these remarks, I'm afraid, but they may still be useful to repeat these kind of remarks so as to signal time and again that the present is the result of a very singular human history of nature, not the ineluctable result of the development of scientific discoveries. Let's switch now to the difficulties that the concept of Anthropocene harbors. The main one comes from its globality, as I said before. If the Anthropocene is more than anthropization, then if the new geological era signals the eruption of a new science of terrestrial interactions, a science which is not the mere aggregation of knowledge on ecosystems, on geosystems, and on anthroposystems, then what are we to do with this knowledge? How are we to integrate these various branches so as to better understand the effects at various scales of the retroaction loops connecting environmental transformations, climatic changes, the evolution of biotic communities, and human practices? Ecology and anthropology demonstrate as sciences the great difficulty met by disciplines whose object is to describe and to model at the local level of an ecosystem or of a human community the behavior and the interactions of a great number of agents in a great number of situations. So how are we to imagine a science which would be capable to do that at the scale of the Earth while respecting each level of saliency, each mode of interagentivity between the elements that are being studied? Such a science remains to be built in the guise of a vast collective intelligence, and this is the most pressing challenge that the Anthropocene is pressing upon us. But above all, the globality of the Anthropocene leads to ponder the cosmopolitic answers that might be offered to the systemic upheavals affecting the Earth. One can understand, of course, that phenomena of a global nature require global mechanisms, that is, mechanisms that are intergovernmental, such as the IPCC or the Conference of Parties, in order to try and reach a consensus on palliative measures. In view of the present state of the world, one hardly sees how to proceed otherwise in the short term. However, apart from the fact that the common citizens of the Earth are generally excluded from that kind of mechanism, most environmental alterations are situated at another scale and thus require another scale of analysis and another scale of mobilization. The devastation of a native territory by oil extraction in Amazonia, and I've been the witness of such things. The pollution of a river basin by a mining company in Nepal. The contamination by radioactive waste of the marine fauna in Japan. The water pollution by nitrates in Brittany. All this and 1,000 other cases no doubt fall within the ambit of a general ecocide, and one the more insidious in that it is not willfully coordinated, but an ecocide which can only be opposed efficaciously at the local level by local communities of human and non-humans. For political reasons, that is, politics of knowledge and politics of action, it thus appears perilous to dissociate the systemic future of the Earth from the future of the collectives of humans and non-humans who find themselves variably exposed due to their location and due to their situation in a network of globalization to the consequences of global warming as much as to other kinds of ecological threats and land grabbing. Global warming is indeed global at the scale of the science, of the sciences which study it, but it takes distinct forms for the collectives of humans and non-humans according to the places they inhabit and to the means they have access to deflect some of its effects. In other words, we are all indeed, we humans on board the same ship, but it is not at all the same thing to be confined in the lower cargo holds, the first to be drowned, or on the first-class deck near the lifeboats. However, there is one thing we can do collectively as scholars, and it is to alter the course of the ship in the long term, perhaps, but before it is too late. And how can we do that? Well, it is to change the engines and to change the mode of navigation. We are scholars, and if we can be useful, it is also, and above all, by trying to transform our scientific vision of the way in which we inhabit the Earth, hoping that our ideas will diffuse beyond laboratories and beyond lecture halls like this one. From this point of view, it seems to me that we need to deeply rethink three processes which play a central role in the relations between humans as much as in the relations between humans and non-humans. One, the way in which humans adapt to their milieus. Second, the manner in which they appropriate these milieus. And three, the ways to confer to these milieux a political expression. Let's begin with adaptation. I have been, as I said when presenting myself, feeling for many years a deep distrust toward the functionalism of this idea of adaptation, taken as a sort of response of societies to environmental constraints whose nature and mode of expression would be independent of human collectives. My experience as an anthropologist of nature showed me at least two things in that domain. First, that the diversity of human behavior that are reputedly adaptive to the same environmental constraints is so vast that almost any institution can be called adaptive. And so it's a Panglossian reasoning which divests of all scientific relevance the notion of adaptation so conceived. On the other hand, we know better now that the relation between environmental conditions and human activities is not ruled by a behaviorist model of stimuli and responses, in that humans actively participate, since long before the Holocene, to the production of the environmental factors which affect their existence, usually without being conscious of it. I've already mentioned examples of that, notably that of the Amazonian rainforest. Actually, as is also the case with other organisms, the adaptation of humans does not operate exclusively in terms of the selection of the individually best fit to live in a given environment. It is also realized by the progressive instauration of niches favorable to certain modes of existence. But with the Anthropocene, however, this co-evolution of human populations and non-human organisms undergoes a double transformation. What happened non-intentionally and on a multi-millennial timescale now appears to us, to some of us at least, as requiring a proactive intervention to be led within a very short time limit. So global warming becomes a major environmental constraint, by contrast with the kind of constraints I was discarding before. a constraint to which human societies have to adapt precisely, and not like they did before. Not like they did before at a local scale, that is, by using a whole gamut of micro adjustments with retroactive effects, thanks to which they had progressively transformed numerous ecosystems so as to render them more suitable or more hospitable to the human presence. Besides, and to face the urgency of climatic change, we need to assimilate and propagate this idea, this still new idea, that our destiny does not boil down to a more or less hostile confrontation between man and nature, mediated by technique, which is the kind of things that you still are being taught in school, as the modernist tradition has added, no? But that this destiny entirely depends from the billions of actions and interactions and retroactions through which we daily generate the environmental conditions allowing us to inhabit the Earth. So a better apprehension of these processes, to begin with through a teaching at school of the basic principles of scientific ecology, and I would add anthropology also, would render us more aware of the myriad of vital connections which relate us to organic and abiotic non-humans. Let's switch now to appropriation. Ever since the beginning of the enclosures, the movement started in the Middle Ages in the British Isles, the end of the Middle Ages. First Europe and then the rest of the world have constantly transformed into alienable and privately owned goods, an ever-increasing part of our milieus. Pastures, forests, arable land, sources of energy, water, genetic resources, ecological and biological knowledge. So this movement has as a consequence that values indispensable to life can be appropriated. And this is something which is quite new in the history of humanity. And also that these values must primarily be seen as economic resources that is used in the production of goods or which become goods by destination. So I think it is very urgent to give back to the commons their primary meaning. That is, not so much a resource, the exploitation of which will be open to everyone, rather a shared milieu for which everyone is held accountable. But undoubtedly, it is also very urgent to extend the perimeter of the inalienable components of these collectively owned common milieus way beyond the usual objects I mentioned a while ago, and also include among them the climate, biodiversity, the atmosphere, knowledge, health, and things like the plurality of languages or an unpolluted environments. This would, of course, imply to overthrow the usual notion of appropriation as the act by which an individual or a community becomes entitled to a right of use and abuse over a component of the world, and to replace it by a mechanism in which it would be rather ecosystems or systems of interaction between humans and non-humans who would be the bearer of rights of which the humans could be usufructuaries, or in certain conditions, guarantors. In such a case, appropriation would go from the milieus to the humans and not the reverse. And this leads us to the last concept which needs reformulation, that of representation. By this, I mean the delegation of responsibility or free will, which allows agents engaged in collectives of humans and non-humans to assert their point of view through a third party in the deliberation on common affairs. Due in particular to the division between things and persons, which is inherited from the Roman law, this faculty of representation is only granted now to humans, at least directly. Now, in view of what I just said on appropriation, it seems essential that the greatest possible number of agents contributing to the life in common should see their situation represented, and that this representation be expressed in a bolder form than the one which tends to emerge now of a selective extension of a few human rights to a few species of animals, which would present with humans similarities in terms of sensibility and cognition. So the early signs of such a movement are visible, for instance, in the Great Ape Projects, in the demands then that apes should be granted specific rights. I'm thinking also of an amendment that was introduced in the French Civil Code recently, which displaces the definition of domestic animals from movable property to living being endowed with sensibility. But one can see also that this kind of extension of human rights to non-human animals is still largely anthropocentric, since the argument used to extend on certain animals a juridical protection remains the proximity that these animals show in relation to humans, and ipso facto, the capacity that the latter possess of identifying themselves, often in a very abstract way, to the members of this animal species. It thus applies to chimpanzees, to dolphins, or to horses, but no one would think of claiming interesting rights for sardines or for the virus of the Asian flu. So this kind of claim falls within the domain of modern political theory, based on what Macpherson has called possessive individualism, that is, upon this idea, initially developed by Hobbes and by Locke in particular, according to which the human individual is by definition the exclusive owner of himself, of his person, of his capacities, and that he is not therefore indebted for his person to any ruling body that would be external and superior to him, be it society, the church, God, a sovereign, group of descent, etc., etc. This conception, which is unheard of in other political and juridical systems, became the keystone of modern individualism and the foundation of contemporary democracies. In that context, society is seen as the sum of free and equal individuals who are only bound to one another because they own their respective capacities, which allow them to establish relations of exchange that are freely accepted. So the inclusion of animal species in this system of individual rights, inasmuch as some of them would own similar qualities to that of humans, might foster interesting juridical questions as to how a delegation of power might be granted to these new non-human individuals, but this move would certainly not allow a greater number of components of the world to be admitted to the dignity of political subjects, since this dignity, due to its anthropocentric definition, is necessarily, in that case, restricted to a small number of animal species and to them alone. This is why one has to envision that could be represented not so much beings as such, that is, humans, states, chimpanzees, multinationals, but proper ecosystems, that is, relations of a certain type between beings localized in more or less extended spaces, in life-supporting milieus, whatever the nature, river basins, mountain ranges, towns, boroughs, seaboards, ecologically fragile zones, lakes, seas, etc., etc. A true political ecology, a true political, cosmopolitics, properly speaking, would not content itself with granting intrinsic rights to nature while failing to give it the means to exercise these rights, as is the case with the Ecuadorian. Some of you may know the Ecuadorian Constitution, as in this preamble, has granted rights to nature. But this is nature in such a case is an abstraction when no means are given to nature to exercise these rights. A true cosmopolitics would endeavor to transform milieus and everything which compose them, including humans, into political subjects whose representatives would be humans, of course. In that way, a concrete political expression might be given to what I have called, in one of my books, Beyond Nature and Culture, the relative universal. That is, the idea that a new universalism of values should be based on systems of relations rather than on qualities attached to beings. And in their role as representatives, humans would be not anymore the source of the right legitimating the appropriation of nature. They would be the quite diversified representatives of a multitude of natures from which they would have become juridically inseparable. Such a conception might appear bizarre at first glance, but it only seems bizarre in view of the individualist foundations of our present juridical and political system. For ethnology and history provide us with a wealth of cases, including contemporary cases, of collectives in which the status of humans is derived not from the capacities which are said to be universally attached to their person, but from their belonging to a particular collective which mixes indissolubly territories, plants, mountains, animal, sites, deities, and a multitude of other beings, everywhere, everyone being in constant interaction with the others. So in such systems, humans do not own nature, they are owned by nature. Why do I think that these propositions are not completely utopians? First, because my experience as an anthropologist precisely, and the knowledge, because of this knowledge that cosmological and political systems, rights of usage, modes of knowledge, forms of technical expertise, have rendered possible in other historical contexts the kind of assemblage I am referring to. But also the fact that the cosmological outlook that these extra-modern collectives have developed slowly begins to seep into our own system, opening breaches into the Eurocentric individualism of modern capitalism. And this seeping takes various forms, but is most often a product of the struggles, of the confrontations of extra-modern collectives attempting to get their own cosmopolitics recognized as a legitimate mode of existence. Well-known examples are the recent granting of legal personhood to the Wanganui River and the Te Urewera Forest in New Zealand after a long legal battle fought by the Maori people. The same status was granted to the Atrato River in northwestern Colombia in similar circumstances. And not a week passes without native or local communities the world over pushing for these kinds of rights to be recognized, including in Europe, including in France with the recent case of the what we call ZAD, what is called ZAD in France, Zone à défendre, Zone to be defended, of Notre-Dame-des-Landes near Nantes in western France. So far from being memorialists of a nostalgic past doomed to disappear, anthropologists collaborating with collectives who defiantly refuse to be absorbed by modernity are thus witness that other ways of inhabiting the earth are possible, since some of these ways are still obdurately maintained, while others are in the process of emerging in the heart of the capitalist world under our own eyes, provided we recognize these forms for what they are. So along with other scholars, we are thus now in a position to show that the future is not just a linear expansion of the present, that it contains unheard of potentialities, the realization of which we must imagine in order to build a true common home before the old one crumbles under the casual devastation it was submitted to by, not by the whole of humanity, by some humans. Thank you.
Thank you, Philippe. This was, I was struggling to to keep up. You went fast. You've been thinking about this for a long time, I think, and you've opened up possibilities for imagining how we can do this Anthropocene that we have. How can we do it generatively? Maybe I just start by telling a story, and it's a story where I met the Anthropocene. You know, it's hard to meet the Anthropocene outside the academy, outside institutions of governance and so on. So when one meets the Anthropocene in unexpected places, this is very valuable. So I met it once when I was visiting a coastal village in Papua New Guinea. I was there on family business. The family, this is a village on an island called Uratai in the Torres Strait between Australia and Papua New Guinea. It's part of Papua New Guinea. It's very close to Papua New Guinea. There are just a few meters making it a Torres Strait island. But my granddaughter has her mother's family there. So we were there on family business. and the first, our host told us a story. And they said that they really are the most Christian people, because when Christianity came to these islands, these people, the ancestors of my granddaughter's of my co-grandparenting relations, ate them. So we ate the word, they say, or our ancestors ate the word. So we are literally the embodiment of the word. And so this really is a very nice joke, and it's told very often in these islands. It's a joke that these people tell against themselves. And of course, we found this very funny, and my husband, who's a very large man with a very large laugh, laughed so loudly that everybody in the village heard it, and of course asked what he was laughing at. So the joke was told, and so the joke re-emerged and became part of the ongoing life of the village for the several weeks we were there. And so this joke of eating the word, and while this is not something that is approved of by these people now, they said, but remember what we did next. We became Christians, and in fact we are the most Christian people, and indeed they are very Christian people. What we have to look at what's eating us now. What's eating us now are the very high tides we are getting. The sea is eating our sweet potato and taro. So we have to go back and think of our eating of the word to find a way of dealing with this sea eating us. And this for me was a people meeting the Anthropocene and finding the cultural resources within their own traditions to do something about it. So I want to put that story, I'm telling this story to Philippe, to ask him, so if we take this story, it's me doing ethnography at a time when I should not be doing ethnography. I should be doing family work, but ethnographers are like this.
They do ethnography all the time,
yes.
including now and here. Can we think about this as a situation of a people in a place at a particular time, and think about it perhaps in terms of adaptation, appropriations, and what we'll say cosmopolitics. Yes? I would like to answer by emphasizing two forms of response to environmental changes. One is of the type that you describe, and many of my doctoral students are studying these kind of cases, in particular in places where global warming is felt more intensely than anywhere else, that is in the high altitudes and in the high latitudes, that is where there are glaciers or in the high mountains, where the glaciers are melting at an incredible rate, and in the northernmost part of the Americas or Asia, where the global warming has consequences, in particular in their effect on the animals. I have former students in particular who worked with the Gwich'in in northern Alaska, and the roots of the caribou herds have been transformed by global warming. The presence of polar bear very much to the south of their normal range also has been observed. And all this, of course, is seen with amazement by the people. And they, as you mentioned in the case of Papua New Guinea, try to understand it in their own in their own framework. The terrible thing is that I'm thinking here of a work by precisely a young anthropologist working in the high Andes, is that the people take upon themselves the responsibility for the changes. The responsibility for the changes in the sense that if the weather is changing, there's more rain, again, the glaciers are melting, etc., it's because they are not doing properly the rites, because people are progressively abandoning the rituals that they used to do to honor the deities. The mountains are deities, no? To honor the deities that are not doing the proper sacrifice, etc., etc. So it's a terribly sad result of the fact that we, in the modern world, through our action, have managed to change the climate, and that these people who have absolutely no responsibility in this change feel that themselves are responsible for this change. This is one of a series of responses to global warming. But there is another way also to respond to environmental transformation, which is when it's directly seen as, well, it's, the word desecration is not very good because there is no sacred in the traditional Christian sense in this, but when a transformation of the environment is brought about by human actors in a very obvious way. And this is the case with mining, for instance, which is being practiced in the Andes systematically in the way that was invented in the United States, in Australia, etc. That is deep mining by cutting up a mountain, no? Completely. It's not mining as it was done in the Andes for many centuries, and is well known that is by drilling holes in mountains and trying to negotiate the fact that you are taking something out of the mountain with the spirits in the mountain, but destroying the mountain with the huge machinery. And what if, as this mountain is very often a person, a deity, of course, it's part of the collective which is formed. So we can get back now to our to the schemes you mentioned. What is an analogist collective? An analogist collective is a collective which is composed of innumerable humans and non-humans who interact, who are fragmented, who are structured by devices like hierarchy, correspondence, systems of analogies and correspondence, etc. And so anything which affects one element of this vast collective, of the socio-cosmic collective, affects all the others. So it's only in this kind of collective, for instance, that human behavior will affect the climate, for instance. Incest will provoke rain. the fact that you did not do the good sacrifice at the good time will provoke drought, etc., etc. This is a typically analogy system. In these circumstances, and there are cases, there's a series of cases that have been studied by anthropologists. I'm thinking of the work by Marisol de la Cadena, but there are others also in Peru. The reaction that we observe appear to be the reaction of an ecological movement against spoliation, land spoliation. So it's something which is recognizable, no? These people protest against the destruction of their resources. They protest against the destruction of their environment, against the spoliation of land, etc. But in fact, what they do, also perhaps, and perhaps foremost, in the Andes in particular, is that they feel that they are responsible, these humans, for the proper functioning of this socio-cosmic whole. And if one of the elements of the socio-cosmic whole is attacked, a mountain, then the consequences will fall on everyone, and on themselves in particular. So what was seen from, let's say, a Marxist-Leninist point of view for many years as a social movement fighting a situation of oppression and ecological destruction is in fact a form of reaction which has nothing to do with the ways that are used in the West by social movements. And if I mention the case of the Zone à Défendre, the ZAD, in France, it's interesting because in fact you find in this context, which is a naturalist context then, a form of association in a place, it's a zone of wetlands, no? South of Nantes, that is by the western coast of France, south of Brittany. It's a zone of wetlands, and then there are in this area, there were people that, there were farms. Some of them were expropriated and went away. Others were expropriated, decided to stay. And then there was an association of an aggregation of other people who came from all over the place in France and beyond, because they felt they identified not only with the humans, but also with the non-humans, the specific ecosystem there that had to be defended precisely. And they start building huts, and there's a very innovative architecture there by building, it's arquitectura povera in a certain way, no? It's made out of bricolage and things. But, and this has developed for it's a collective experiment, social experiment, which I found extremely interesting. And they are fighting for their way to, in fact, express what I meant when I said that the ecosystem should be granted rights. In fact, they voice, or they see themselves as the voice of the environment. So they defend, of course, their position as humans, but they defend their positions as humans representing a milieu. And so I find this extremely interesting because all over the world now, through struggles, through confrontations, even violent confrontations, we find people who associate themselves to some kinds of environment instead of maintaining a naturalist point of view. This is from what we derive our subsistence, and we need these resources in order to maintain ourselves, which is, of course, also a reason, but not the main one. It's a more, so people use spiritual I don't like the word spiritual because it's so linked to Christianity also, except if you mean by spiritual the fact that there are spirits, which so that I recognize as an animist configuration. No? So I find the present situation far from despairing precisely because of these movements. No? And because of these movements, and so our job, our mission, our responsibility as social scientists, and when I mean social scientists, in fact, the science that I would like to see emerge that was in a way prefigured by great figures like Humboldt or Gregory Bateson is a science of relations that would include both the relations between humans and the relations between non-humans and the relations between humans and non-humans, which would integrate ethology, history, ecology, anthropology, etc., etc., etc. And this science, this is why I said we have a responsibility as scientists to develop this kind of science, which would be more integrated and different from the one we, so that some of us practice in a way, but which does not exist yet as a science. And as such, not only do we have the responsibility to develop this kind of science, but we have the responsibility also to make these innovations in the use of land known, to try to understand them, and to try to popularize them, or at least to make them understood better by a more general audience.
Yes, maybe I can tell another story. That I was wondering what my in-laws really on this island of Urutai, they said that we must go back and see how we became Christians after we ate the word and how they knew something different. So what they're talking about there is we need to understand how we are knowers and what it is that we know. And I was very interested to find this again in northern Norway, and this has to do with a rock. And in northern Norway, it's called this is in Sápmi, which I think might also be analogous in your schema. But there's a rock, and you know, in Norway, it really, the road builders in northern Norway are really, really important, the road engineers. And the road engineers are under such strain these days with the melting and the avalanches occurring in new places. And so the road engineers in northern Norway are to do their work, they must prevent, if possible, the avalanches from happening. But more and more are happening, and they're happening in different ways and in new places. And so they worry about rocks but near roads. But the other peoples in that area with a very great interest in rocks are the Sami population, who know rocks in a very different way than road engineers. So, but routinely now, the road engineers must meet with Sami if they want to blow up a rock, and road engineers love blowing up rocks, I think. There needs to be a discussion. So I was in a room with some road engineers, with some Sami men and women, because Sami men and women have different knowledge of rocks, and with anthropologists, and there was I, an empirical epistemologist. So this must be a conversation. These sorts of conversations are the sorts of conversations we need to learn to do better. So do you have thoughts on that story?
Do you know that in Iceland, when the road engineers are building a road, they make an inquiry first as to whether there are trolls in the area, so not as to disrupt the trolls. So there's no indeed. Well,
how do they make this inquiry?
By asking the people locally.
Okay.
They would know. So this kind of inquest is rather common in some parts, and it's the case in. So you wonder sometimes in Iceland, because there's a very straight road in a straight landscape, obviously, and then there's a bend that goes around. It's because there's a family of trolls there that shouldn't be disturbed. This is beginning also, but the problem is it's very difficult to. When you speak of native knowledge, which is a common concern of us and of anthropologists working with what I call extra-modern collectives, it's extremely difficult to. There shouldn't be a dissociation, as is most often the case, between what appears as positive knowledge and what would be called or understood as superstition or religion, whatever. No. So what has been the normal way to study non-European knowledge for a long time has been to try to extract from inquiries, etc., local ecological knowledge, technical knowledge about ethology, about ecology, about agronomy, etc., etc. The kind of knowledge that can be fed in databases, separating it from the whole context within which the specific knowledge is embedded. I'll give one example. It's traditionally accepted by ethnobiologists that the number of taxa of animals, I think I mentioned that yesterday, but I can't remember, that is known by a competent person in an indigenous community around 500, but it's a maximum. But there are places where people know more than that, over 1,000. And the way this knowledge, which is not structured in a linear fashion, that is with this, the hierarchical segmentation, no? With an encapsulation of super-generic categories, the way it is known is that the taxa are remembered in relation to the place where they were first seen. So there is a whole mental exercise which, in fact, is akin to the former ars memoriae, whereby one memorizes a discourse by associating parts of the discourse to different places, which is the very classical thing, which is how Cicero memorized his discourses. No, and of course, so the knowledge that one has of taxonomy is in fact linked to the knowledge that one has of a topology, which is again linked to the knowledge that one has of the specific spirits that inhabit this topology, etc., etc. And you can't dissociate taxonomical knowledge from the whole conundrum of knowledge that goes with it, no? And this is exactly the kind of separation that has been most common. It was very common when I started being interested in what was called at the time environmental anthropology many, many years ago.
Thank you, Philippe. Maybe it's time to include you all with comments and questions and stories. And we have our first person, so.
Thank you for your speech. First, I would underline and undersign most of your demands on a local and native and traditional scale to confront the changes and the effects we witness. But I have to add one significant aspect which is hard to tackle. That's the transnational corporations that are dealing with, on one side, with different issues on a local scale of law, and with geopolitical and interests on the other side. So this is also a global effect we witness at this very moment. So to tackle the interests of the multitude of the species on a local scale by confronting the transnational cooperation is hardly to tackle for me in my mind, and hardly to confront, which we have already witnessed on several confrontations throughout the world. What would you say how to tackle this issue within your ideas on local sphere and the multitude of species?
I think from the legal point of view, there would be no problem in implementing the kind of proposition I've made. And in fact, there's I know a legal scholar, a young legal scholar in France who has published 2 books which in fact show that within the actual legal system, the French legal system, it's possible for this kind of shift to happen. It's not impossible also within the French legal system is very much like the German legal system, which is different from the common law. But in the common law in New Zealand did not prevent the granting of juridical personhood to a river and to a forest. And again in Colombia, which is more the juridical system more akin to the French system of granting juridical personhood to a river. So juridically, it's not a question. It's not a technical question. It's rather a question of mental reformation. But what is obviously the problem is this is why I spoke of scales multiple times. No, it's a question of scales. No, all these experiments, whether they are confirmed by law or whether they are just movements like Notre-Dame-des-Landes or movements in the Andes, etc., if they result in a local system being granted rights, then the problem will be how to articulate all these local systems beyond probably the domain of the state. What will be the forms of interactions between these systems? And we are so used, inclusively, intellectually, to the states as at least for the past 3-4 centuries, being the sort of Westphalian system whereby there's a territory with boundaries, that are recognized by the neighbors, even if they try to grab a little bit from time to time. But still, it's the coincidence between a sovereignty and a piece of land. We are so used to this system and to the fact that the concert of nations is based on the consultation between these sovereignties on territories, that it's very difficult for us to imagine other forms of cohabiting, co-dealing with the world that are not based on this system. But one of the interests of anthropology precisely is that it provides no, well, I can't speak of models because no historical model can be transposed automatically from one historical circumstance to another, but at least forms of cohabiting in the same space. I'm thinking of a number of examples. The typical example of cohabitation is when you have nomadic herders that use a route of transhumance, which can be very long, several hundred kilometers, that goes in along the territories of the land of sedentary people. So there are numerous examples of the complex negotiations that are obtained, that needs to be done, but which finally become recurrent, which allow this kind of superposition. There's a beautiful example of which is a very, very nice cohabitation between different forms of collectives that use the land differently at different times of the year, etc., in the upper Swat Valley in Pakistan, that has been described by Frederick Barth. And it's a remarkable, these things should be learned at school, no, to show that other forms of relation to land are possible, that they exist, that we are not condemned, in fact, to the kind of Westphalian societies, Westphalian territories that have been the norm for the past 3 centuries. So I think what we need is, on the one hand, imagination, goodwill, of course, but also knowledge that such systems exist or have existed. They are progressively being destroyed. No, that's true. They are progressively being destroyed. The upper Swat Valley system described by Barth does not exist anymore. There is a system in the Andes which is very well known, which is called the vertical archipelago, whereby a community exploits land. But the community is located at mid-range around 3,000 meters and exploits land in the uplands, 4,000 and above, and in the lowlands, 1,000 more or less. And this has been, the Inca state was based on this system, but there are actual communities that still use this system. They've been described in particular in Bolivia. They were the most common form of distributed use of the land, and we need to become again conversant with these forms of distributed use of the land.
Yes, I think there is.
Thank you very much. I was interested in your mention of SAD, because this is very similar to my own field sites, intentional communities. And I'm curious, what do you think as indigenous knowledge enters this global circulation of knowledge, presenting alternative ways to engage with the natural worlds and non-human actors. I wonder if you think that there is a way for this to really generate new ontological perspectives that are not appropriative of indigenous knowledge. For example, if it's possible to borrow from these alternative ways of knowing without, while doing it in a respectful and conscious way.
Well, when one talk of appropriating local knowledge or native knowledge, one thinks, of course, of biopiracy, mainly. But precisely, biopiracy is a product of this segmentation that I was mentioning. On the one hand, you extract some knowledge that people have about the use of plants, and you try to experiment afterwards whether this or that kind of plant indeed has a pharmacological effect on such a symptom, etc., etc. But if you do that, of course, and there's been long discussions among native people of whether knowledge should be appropriated in this context, no? And it's interesting to see that although some native groups do claim native appropriation of knowledge, others do not, because they say that, in fact, it's a capitalist obsession, appropriation, no, and in particular appropriation of knowledge, and they don't want to participate precisely in this sort of mad course of appropriating everything, including knowledge. So it's a difficult situation because, in fact, as I was mentioning, I was a few weeks ago back in Ecuador in an interesting circumstance. The Achua had asked me, my wife, and a few of our former students who had been working in the area, to discuss with them what we had been doing. They had read us, because we've been translated into Spanish, and so now the new generation, the grandchildren of the people with whom I interacted, some of them have gone to university, some of them have masters in sociology, etc., etc. Some of them know epistemology, they have read Kuhn, etc. No, so it's an interesting situation now, and they wanted to discuss precisely what was it that really anthropologists contributed to the knowledge, to their self-knowledge, etc. And in fact, the result of this discussion was that they needed the view from afar, in the sense that they needed people who would allow them to understand what was their position in the world. Not obviously ethnography, because the best ethnographers are probably people who know, although there's the time difference. I mean, it's a parenthesis, but some of the things that this generation of Achua know, they know it through our books, because there's been a breach in the transmission. And so it's a paradox that I never thought when I was writing, I don't write anymore on the Achua, not as I used to do, but at the time I'd never thought that what I was writing would be taken, in some cases at face value, by the Achua themselves. Because what you do as an ethnographer is you normalize the knowledge. It's almost impossible not to do so. So you make typologies. And I was struck by the fact that, in particular, what I wrote on dreams, on neuromancy, is extremely important in this culture. And so I wrote a piece in Man, the British journal, years ago, on Achua neuromancy, which has been translated into Spanish and now is the sort of official basis of how the Achua and the Shwa present, in fact, the system of oniromancy, which in fact is more complicated than that. The typology is, I think, correct, but there are relations between dreams, visions, etc., etc. So we have a responsibility, in a way, in this objectification of knowledge, when it is not transmitted anymore, or very partly transmitted in traditional circumstances. But at the same time, what we can do, and is by the view we have from what I know of the Australian Aborigines, because I've read a lot about them, can be brought back to the Achua, not in the form of a description of who they are, but in the way they deal precisely with the same questions that the Achua do in different ways. And this is the kind of knowledge and expertise that we can bring to native populations, in the sense that by our the way we acquire knowledge about the diversity of cultures, to use the standard word, we are in a position precisely to put in perspective local traditions, which people locally need to know. So it's interesting, because in a way it goes contrarily to the trend of nationalism, which is so worrying in Europe, for instance. What they ask of us is to have an external gaze on them, which is exactly the contrary of nationalist movements in Europe.
Okay. Yes.
I would like to come back to this issue of scales, and in this context ask, how do we have to envisage the notion of cohabiting the same space in the context of the Anthropocene, knowing that, let's say, there are societies which on a daily basis, on an hourly basis, are interfering in other societies, communities around the world. What does it mean then to cohabit the same space? And what kind of exchange modes, and how do we conceptualize what you call the assemblage on this planetary context of the Anthropocene? I very well understand this related to local contexts, but since in the Anthropocene context we are interfering, or there are interferences globally planetary, what does that mean to share the same space, to share knowledge systems, to share whatever? Because we are constantly interfering in life systems, ecosystems we don't know. We have even not met or experienced in any way.
Yes, it's the major challenge of this century. So I can't answer it because it requires collective intelligence for that. But it's perfectly clear that is the main problem, of course, because intergovernmental agencies like the one I mentioned that deal with the climate, of course, are the reflection of the activities of states, and even like that, it's not very easy, as the case of the United States going away from the Paris Agreement has shown. But we must invent new forms, precisely. I mean, we are facing the same kind of conceptual upheaval and challenge that the great minds of the Enlightenment were facing or the thinkers of socialism in the 19th century. Exactly the same kinds of problems with the same gravity and the same effort of imagination that are required. What I want to emphasize, in spite of the fact that I don't have an answer for that, is that we shouldn't recoil from the task. We should be very clear that this is our task and that we have to face it. And it's not the worst threat would be what my colleague and friend François Hartog called presentism. No? That's the idea that the present is eternal, and that in fact the regime, not only of temporality, which is mainly what he means by presentism, but the actual regime is the one which is going to go on for the centuries to come until perhaps the final catastrophe. No, I think we have to react to that and to invent absolutely new forms of being together and confronting each other also that are unheard of, but for which precisely history and anthropology provide, if not models, at least information as to how people have faced the challenges of living together in very different environments at different and cohabiting precisely in this kind of space. So it's a collective challenge.
Well, we have time for one more question.
I think that's me.
Yes, yes.
So, thank you very much, both. My question relates to this problem that the Anthropocene is often linked with kind of a victimization of the planet, and that kind of seems to distort some of these like power relations and narratives, in my opinion. And that's why I really like this story of that the people who ate the word and then kind of embodied the word and had knowledge of the word, and also distorted these maybe original power relations between kind of the Christian missionary coming in and trying to spread the word. And then if you think about what it means, the sea is eating us, and does that mean the sea is becoming this elusive anthropos that you also kind of were getting at? So I was just wondering if you could talk more about this kind of idea of the planet as victim and us as victims of our own making.
I don't think that reasoning in terms of victim is a good way to proceed. It's a prevailing, yes, but I think I think the reaction to a misdeed, whatever the misdeed, should be a reaction, not the transformation of oneself into a victim, which I think it hinges on a turn which is visible, including in anthropology, which is a moral turn. This is not a question of morality, it's a question of politics, and it's a question of politics in the sense not so much of power relations. As I said yesterday, there are power relations everywhere, but in power relations, in relations between worlds, between eventually ontologically distinct agents that are, for whatever reason, in a capacity to connect or confront elements of the world that are ontologically distinct. And this is why a political subject, for me, is more than humans, either individually or collectively, but a political subject is perhaps may be a form of relation that exists and which can overturn another form of relation. No? So we have to de-anthropocentrize also, I think, politics in that sense. And this would be a way precisely to escape from the victimization posture, which I think leads nowhere.
And if I just might, as I understood the person turning the story in that way, the eating was not the end. The eating was a generative act that engendered possibilities for remaking, and this was the moment that she was trying to bring out. So it's that generativity that eating implies.
Can I finish with something with on cannibalism precisely? There's a very interesting interpretation of Tupinamb Cannibalism by Eduardo Viveros de Castro and Maria Manuela Carneiro da Cunha. The Tupinamba were, in fact, a very large population on the coast of Brazil, and who lived in villages, and they were very similar in many respects. And so they practiced this form of well-known cannibalism, in which during feuds between villagers, they captured a man, several men. These men were given as pets to the women, so they had sex, they saw children, and after about 10 years, these pets were put to death after a simulacra of fighting, during which the victim insulted the people who were going to kill him and said, "I've eaten a lot of your kin, and I'm fat because of that," etc. So imagine the situation where someone was been living in the village, was children in the village, etc. Suddenly has been transformed into a pet, suddenly becomes again the enemy after 10 years. And the interpretation that they have, there were lots of interpretation previously on Tupinamb Cannibalism, that it was a sacrifice, etc. But it's not a sacrifice. They are not sacrificed to anyone. No. So that it was a way precisely to create a form of alterization, perhaps, between people who are too close. And so by the fact that of this final ritual in which people said, I've eaten your kin and my people will eat you, is a way to provoke a sort of schismogenesis, to use the Batesonian term, no? A differentiation between people who are too close. So I don't advocate this for differentiation, but it's one way to use cannibalism.